The dried stalks inside the bedding material shifted and rustled with my every movement, a sound that became magnified because it was the solitary noise occupying the absolute stillness of the room. My hair remained tightly bound in the exact style my mother had constructed early that morning, before the arrival of the wedding assembly. 12 hours prior, I had simply been a young girl dragging benches into my family's barn to accommodate the marriage guests. Now, I sat perched upon the edge of a mattress in a domicile that felt entirely foreign. From the rooms below, the sounds of my new spouse echoed as he secured the rear entryway lock and extinguished the main kitchen lantern. Resting in my palms was a small, creased slip of paper that my maternal aunt had surreptitiously transferred to me during the post-wedding gathering, containing a brief 6-word mandate penciled onto the surface. "Whatever he asks, you must give." I grew up within an Old Order settlement in Lancaster County, entering marriage at 19 and ultimately engineering my departure at 24. These profound realities were burdens I carried in absolute privacy for an extended duration before finding the internal readiness to vocalize them. If you have never been exposed to the actual occurrences that transpire beneath the traditional prayer covering, this narrative serves to illuminate those hidden experiences. To properly evaluate this dynamic, one must first comprehend that within the plain community, the institution of marriage is constructed upon a completely different foundation than the one utilized by contemporary society. It functions as a strict covenant, featuring a rigid, divinely ordained hierarchy woven directly into its structural base. The husband commands, while the wife capitulates. This arrangement is never merely hinted at or subtly implied. It is articulated with absolute clarity from the pulpit, reinforced continuously throughout Sunday sermons, and deeply embedded within the moral tales transmitted to offspring long before they attain the cognitive capacity to question them. By the time a young woman reaches her wedding day, the directive to capitulate has been spoken over her identity so continuously that it ceases to register as a mere behavioral instruction, transforming instead into an inevitable condition of existence, much like the changing weather. Within my specific church district, the presiding bishop consistently oriented his messages around the New Testament mandate commanding wives to submit entirely to their husbands. This specific passage was preached with unyielding frequency and immense theological weight, whereas the subsequent directives instructing husbands to exercise sacrificial tenderness toward their partners were treated as entirely self-evident assumptions requiring no targeted structural emphasis. The lesson of absolute submission was the primary focus, and the socialization process applied to young girls was incredibly thorough, extending across her physical form, her daily schedule, her vocal expressions, and her internal volition until her entire being was systematically bent toward her husband's desires. An exemplary wife was expected to enter matrimony completely devoid of independent personal inclinations, discovering her own desires exclusively by internalizing his first. My marriage to Amos was formalized on a Thursday in November when he was 22 and I was 19, following a brief 7-month courtship. By every analytical standard deployed by our community to evaluate men, he was deemed an exceptional prospect, reserved, industrious, and born into a highly reputable lineage. His father operated a major local sawmill that Amos was structurally designated to inherit, leaving my parents feeling profoundly relieved and appreciative. I distinctly recall my mother cradling my face in her hands on the morning of our nuptials, stating in Pennsylvania Dutch, "Du hast Glück, Martha," assuring me that I was incredibly fortunate. The wedding celebration itself occupies my memory more as a blur of raw sensory impressions than a structured sequence of events. 4 continuous hours of unyielding preaching, hundreds of circulating guests, 2 massive communal meals served in successive shifts, and my lower limbs aching intensely inside footwear I had only donned twice prior. The solitary memory that remains exceptionally sharp is the exact moment my Aunt Lydia directed me into a secluded area near the firewood shelter. She was my mother's elder sibling, an individual the broader family observed with a degree of cautious discomfort, because she consistently articulated her thoughts with a freedom the others strictly denied themselves. She firmly pressed the creased paper into my palm, curling my fingers around the object, her facial expression entirely devoid of warmth. She delivered a single instruction in Pennsylvania Dutch, telling me to read the contents only when completely alone, before immediately retreating into the cacophony of the wedding assembly. I eventually opened the slip, while seated in the carriage during our transit to the farmstead, where Amos and I were designated to spend our inaugural night. Reading those 6 penciled words, a cold sensation trickled through my being, not because the message was ambiguous, but because its implications were instantly and completely clear to me. My aunt was attempting to convey a warning regarding an institutional reality she lacked the social freedom to name aloud, and the fact that she could only articulate this truth through 6 cryptic words on a scrap of paper illustrated the absolute lack of space within our culture to openly discuss the marital expectations imposed upon women. That initial evening did not manifest as the violation I had internally braced myself to endure. Amos exhibited a profound nervousness that caught me entirely off guard, perhaps exceeding my own internal anxiety. He sat motionless upon the edge of the mattress for an extended duration, before making any physical approach, gently inquiring if exhaustion had overtaken me. Upon my affirmation, he stated that we would simply rest, and we proceeded to sleep positioned on completely opposite sides of the bed, without establishing any physical contact, both of us remaining fully clothed. As I lay there tracking his steady, rhythmic breathing, with the creased paper remaining undisturbed within the pocket of my traditional apron, suspended from a nearby chair, I allowed myself to temporarily harbor the belief that Aunt Lydia had perhaps miscalculated the situation, or that I had extracted far more ominous meaning from those 6 words than they actually contained. However, the subsequent evening diverged sharply from the first, and the third night departed even further from that initial reprieve. In the passing weeks, the systemic reality my aunt had attempted to convey without explicit language became something I fully comprehended through physical experience, long before I possessed the psychological vocabulary to define it. Within an old order framework, a husband possesses an absolute, structural entitlement to his wife's physical form. This exact terminology was utilized months later by a senior matriarch within a communal quilting circle, delivered with the casual matter-of-factness one applies to an undisputed, permanent reality, in the exact manner a landowner possesses an absolute right to his acreage. In practical terms, this arrangement dictated that a wife lacked any valid basis for refusal. She could not decline physical intimacy due to overwhelming fatigue, personal illness, unless completely confined to bed by physical incapacitation, deep emotional grief, or, during the vulnerable weeks immediately following childbirth, once a duration the husband personally deemed a sufficient recovery period had elapsed. The authority to determine her readiness was completely stripped from her domain. The concept of refusal simply did not exist within the socialization I had received. The solitary operational word provided to me was to yield. It is vital to state with absolute transparency that Amos was fundamentally not a malicious individual, a realization that must be held concurrently with the rest of this dynamic. He was entirely a product of the exact same social architecture that had constructed my own identity, socialized from early boyhood to understand that a wife's physical form constituted an integrated component of the domestic property, existing in the exact same category as the kitchen facilities or the agricultural barn. He had never been presented with a single conceptual reason to critically analyze this arrangement, questioning its validity no more than he questioned the natural rotation of the seasons. Likewise, I refrained from voicing any verbal objections, because to do so would have fundamentally required me to challenge the entire structural apparatus holding my social reality in place, including the ministerial leadership, the unwritten code of the Ordnung, my paternal authorities, and the very concept of the deity I had been systematically trained to fear and revere long before I mastered the capacity to read. Yet, despite my outward compliance, I questioned the system continuously within the private, hidden quarters of my own consciousness. There were countless nights where I lay completely motionless following these interactions, tracking the ceiling patterns in the dark, while experiencing an internal state I lacked the language to name. Years later, while seated opposite a psychological professional in a small urban office I had reached entirely through my own agency, I would finally acquire the correct clinical term for that defense mechanism: dissociation. It defines the psychological phenomenon of mentally removing oneself from one's own physical form, because remaining fully present within the reality of the situation has exceeded maximum human endurance. My companion, Rebecca, had entered matrimony roughly a year prior to my own wedding. Having navigated our developmental years in tandem, endured baptism during the same summer, and shared the intense, insular closeness unique to young girls who have existed without secrets since early childhood, our bond was profound. Following her marriage, however, her demeanor underwent a subtle yet continuous transformation, resembling the gradual fading of a vibrant pigment. Her laughter grew increasingly rare. She ceased to linger for socializing after Sunday services, and during communal work gatherings, her countenance assumed a distant expression I lacked the capacity to decode at the time. One afternoon, she arrived at my home to assist in processing our tomato harvest, and while we labored together within the confines of the cellar surrounded by condensation-covered glass jars on the shelving, she articulated a question I have preserved in my thoughts ever since. Without raising her gaze from her hands, she softly inquired if anyone had ever informed me that entering matrimony meant forfeiting the right to ever utter a refusal. That specific moment marked the very first instance I witnessed another woman explicitly apply language to this systemic violation, and once the reality had been formally named, it became completely impossible for me to return to a state of blind ignorance. Following that interaction, I began to observe my surroundings with heightened awareness, systematically tracking the behavioral patterns of the women at our social assemblies. I noted the sudden, involuntary stiffening of their physical postures whenever their spouses placed a hand upon their shoulders. I observed the way certain young brides completely ceased making direct eye contact after only a few months of marriage, and I watched the senior matriarchs look upon the younger women with a profound, uncritical sorrow that contained absolutely no element of hope, as though they were witnessing a destructive cycle they had personally attempted to disrupt in the past and failed. An unspoken, yet universally understood knowledge permeated the circle of married women within my community. We possessed complete awareness regarding which husbands practiced a degree of gentleness and which ones did not. We recognized precisely which newly wedded brides were on the verge of discovering the true, unvarnished physical demands of their contracts. We held this collective understanding and maintained absolute silence, because to vocalize the trauma would have initiated a catastrophic fracture in the very social order that kept our entire world upright. To openly acknowledge the reality would require an admission that the structural framework we were continuously assured was entirely holy actually harbored something profoundly unholy, and we were strictly forbidden from entertaining such a belief. The specific evening I realized my continued existence within that structure was impossible transpired 3 years into the marriage, immediately following an early-stage miscarriage. While the pregnancy had not progressed to an advanced phase, it had continued long enough for me to cultivate private expectations and watch a specific name materialize within my internal thoughts. The physical hemorrhaging persisted for numerous days, resulting in a profound depletion that transcended mere physical tiredness, settling instead into the deepest quarters of my internal being. Once a duration he personally evaluated to be a reasonable recovery window had concluded, Amos initiated physical contact one evening under the lamplight. In response, I deployed the solitary, fragile plea I had ever managed to articulate on the subject. whispering for him to please refrain, utilizing that soft appeal precisely because the definitive word no was a linguistic tool I completely lacked within that specific context. He paused his movements, directed his gaze toward me, and stated with absolute calmness, entirely devoid of anger, "Martha, you are my wife." Those 5 words communicated the entire, unyielding mass of the institutional architecture our society had constructed and installed between our identities. He had no need for an elaborate argument. Those few words contained everything. I grasped their exact implication, completely. Having been systematically instructed in their meaning since early childhood, and having formally stood before an assembly of 300 individuals to pledge my compliance to that exact definition. I capitulated that evening, and as I subsequently lay awake tracking the gradual paling of the dawn at the edges of the horizon, I recognized for the very first time with an absolute, unwavering clarity that I was going to escape that world. I understood it would not materialize within that specific year or in the immediate future, but that a departure was inevitable. The execution of that goal required an additional 2 years, 2 years spent covertly depositing microscopic quantities of currency into an old coffee container concealed at the absolute rear of a storage shelf in the cellar. 2 years spent posing highly guarded, strategic questions to a non-Amish woman who managed an agricultural stand near our property, and 2 years of maintaining a perfectly composed, traditional facial expression, while my entire internal self had already migrated far beyond the boundaries of the settlement. Before advancing the narrative, it is necessary to articulate a fundamental truth regarding Amos, because accuracy demands it. He was by no means a monster. He was simply a man who had been presented with a rigid matrix of rules and explicitly informed that the Creator had authored them, prompting him to execute those mandates as faithfully as his conditioning allowed. Following my eventual departure, he managed to transmit a solitary letter to me via a relative who had not yet received formal instructions to enforce the excommunication. The missive consisted of 3 brief sentences, stating that he was entirely unable to comprehend my actions, asserting that he had consistently attempted to be an exemplary provider, and expressing a hope that I would eventually locate internal serenity. I wept intensely over that document for a prolonged duration, because I recognized the absolute sincerity of his words. He had genuinely tried his best within his limitations. He truly possessed no cognitive capacity to comprehend the trauma. The very system that had systematically erased my autonomy had corrupted his humanity through a different mechanism, handing a young man an absolute authority over another human being's physical form that no individual should ever be permitted to wield. Through the process of professional counseling, I gradually acquired the precise vocabulary required to define the architecture I had survived, learning concepts such as systemic coercion, institutionalized marital obligation, and the absolute structural absence of meaningful consent within a framework where refusal is denied any legitimate existence. My therapist did not steer my consciousness toward any predetermined emotional conclusion, opting instead to carve out a secure space wherein I could independently discover my own authentic feelings. When I finally penetrated beneath the layers of protective emotional armor, the primary emotion I encountered was not a burning hatred directed at Amos, but rather an immense, deep grief. It was a profound mourning for the young girl I used to be, the girl seated in that carriage reading 6 penciled words of absolute compliance, and the girl thrust into the institution of marriage completely stripped of a single intellectual tool to comprehend the true nature of what was being extracted from her. My thoughts returned continuously to that young girl and to all the young women who currently embody her reality within those isolated farmhouses, the 19-year-olds who will sit perched upon the edges of mattress ticking, listening to their new spouses secure the households below. I reflect on the cryptic instructions still being pressed into vulnerable palms during wedding receptions, the aunts who possess full awareness of the trauma but lack the freedom to speak it plainly, the mothers who understand the reality intimately, yet maintain absolute muteness, and the religious leaders who endlessly preach absolute submission while systematically omitting the balancing mandates of the text. To remain completely truthful, it is necessary to acknowledge that our domestic existence was not defined exclusively by darkness. There were many mornings where Amos would prepare and bring coffee to me prior to departing for his labor at the sawmill, and evenings where he would read scripture aloud upon the veranda while I worked through a bowl of vegetables, creating an atmosphere of genuine communal warmth. That daylight tenderness was entirely real, but the nighttime hours operated within a completely separate domain, governed by an entirely different matrix of rules, and we possessed absolutely no mechanism to bridge that divide or discuss those experiences in the light of day. This is the central realization that must be fully grasped. The dynamic was not characterized by constant, overt brutality. It was simply that my physical self was fundamentally not my own property. Within that bedroom, my body did not belong to my own identity. It belonged entirely to the institution of marriage, to the unwritten mandates of the Ordnung, and to a concept of the deity that I no longer believe demands the total erasure of a woman's autonomy. The plain world provided me with cultural assets that I will never dismiss as insignificant. A grandmother who gifted me with the intuitive capacity to feel when bread dough had reached perfect consistency without relying on material measurements. A neighborhood that mobilized instantly with provisions when my brother suffered a severe skeletal fracture that incapacitated him from labor. And a foundational faith that, while entirely dismantled and painstakingly reconstructed from completely different ideological materials, granted me in my youth a profound sense of being anchored within an existence vaster than myself. I harbor no regret regarding my birth into that environment. What I mourn deeply is the absolute withholding of vital knowledge, the systematic denial of vocabulary, information, and the simple, foundational realization that a woman's physical form is her own exclusive property. I mourn the withholding of the truth that her affirmation is a matter of profound consequence, and that her refusal is never an act of sinful defiance or rebellion, but constitutes one of the most authentic and sacred boundaries she can possibly offer. If your identity was shaped within an environment that systematically conflated absolute capitulation with divine love, your hidden reality is recognized. If you have ever lay perfectly still adjacent to a partner in the darkness, consciously transferring your awareness elsewhere, because remaining fully present within your own physical form was completely unendurable, your reality is recognized. If you have ever carried the heavy weight of a hushed warning delivered by an elder woman, realizing in an instant that you had been cast into an unforgiving landscape completely devoid of a navigational map, your experience is recognized as well. You were never weak for capitulating. You were a young girl operating within a massive institutional architecture that had systematically eliminated every alternative avenue of self-preservation. The structural failure was never yours to bear. It belonged entirely to the enforced silence, to the dogmatic teaching, and to every single individual who understood the true nature of the violation and consciously chose to protect the system rather than the daughters. Hold this truth permanently within your consciousness. Your physical form is your own exclusive property. Your affirmation belongs entirely to your own volition, and your refusal is a complete and absolute sentence in its own right. No domestic space, no social collective, and no silent partner in the darkness possesses the authority to diminish that validity.